Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is hosting our inaugural event. We're deeply grateful to the museum and all of its staff for its support, as well as for the support that we've received from around Smithsonian and beyond. I would like to let you know that these remarks were to be delivered originally by our secretary, Lonnie Bunch, and unfortunately he is ill, and as of this morning was unable to participate in this and had to actually cut other services and other meetings and events short as well. He's asked me to deliver these remarks on his behalf. Race and racism have always been central factors in the shaping of the United States and beyond. Breonna Taylor, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, so many other names, so many other contemporary victims of racial violence are an ongoing reminder that hatred, bigotry, bias are an ever-present danger. They're not just isolated to the remote past. There's a strange sense of deja vu that I get when I see the widespread return of Jim Crow-style voter suppression, the anti-Asian attacks that have risen dramatically and continue in this country, and the acceptance by large segments of the American public of blatantly racist sentiments and actions that one really hoped had been eradicated in the last 30, 40, 50 years. We are galled, all of us, as a collective here at Smithsonian, by efforts to stifle discourse about racism and slavery, and from erasing slavery's role at the Alamo, for instance, or removing references to Dr. Martin Luther King and Juneteenth from elementary school curriculum. To ignore race and its impact on all of us impedes our ability as a nation to live up to the ideals that are embedded in any number of the founding documents and principles that have been part of the development of this country. And until we admit and grapple with tortured racial pasts that we've inherited and that we still live with, we'll continue to suffer the poisonous effects of racism that poisons our nation and is, in fact, poisoning the world. As James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And so, as part of our effort here at Smithsonian, we're working both internally across the Smithsonian and externally with all of you to believe in developing, redeveloping, revisiting the promise of America. It's time to say that we can be better than this, we are better than this, and it's time to redouble our efforts to repair the nation. And that's what our shared future, reckoning with our racial past is about. It's about sharing and listening and having candid discussions, hard discussions about who we are, where we've been, and where we want to go, even when we don't agree on what that is. This institution-wide project, Smithsonian-wide project, supported by Bank of America, is our effort to contribute to America honestly confronting racism and social inequities by using the resources, the scholarship, the exhibitions, and the collections at our disposal. We also have, we believe at Smithsonian, a great convening power, and so our convening here at Smithsonian, around Smithsonian, and with our partners around the nation and beyond is part of our commitment to this effort. We believe that in these ways, Smithsonian, not an expert on this subject matter, is uniquely positioned to contribute to the nation in these arenas. We're learning ourselves, we're working through this ourselves, and we urge you to work with us. Our ability to convene excellent thinkers, scholars, and activists from throughout the world helps us bring in multiple perspectives and a diversity of thought. I must say I'm really pleased that the panelists who will be presenting this evening were selected not only because they're fabulous thinkers or successful entrepreneurs or just brilliant at what they do, but they are committed activists. And that commitment of activism, along with professional expertise, along with taking the long view, along with a commitment to institutional and organizational change, is as essential as anything else. Despite all the challenges we face, we believe there are ample reasons to be hopeful. In the wake of Mr. Floyd's death, we were heartened to see how many impassioned demonstrations against injustice came about from people not only in the United States, but from all across the globe. It was not the first, but here at Smithsonian, we had to really look at that and wonder, how are people arriving at this same moment in the ways that we are? And from what we've seen in recent years since that time, it looks as though people are not going to be content to settle for less than justice. We're thrilled to have such an esteemed and diverse collection of panelists with us this evening to get this first national conversation, this first inaugural conversation started, the first of what will be a series in many places around the country and beyond, on different levels and in different scales, in major cities and in small towns. And hopefully, our participation will be part of a wider discussion about unresolved conflicts about race and racism that are central to the nation's core values of democracy, equity, equality, freedom, and justice. We want to thank Brian Moynihan in particular, and everyone at Bank of America for supporting this endeavor. I want to personally thank the really broad pan-Smithsonian team and external partners who have made this first inaugural event possible. And now it's my pleasure to introduce an experience. Thank you.
For the day, anamnesis. Anamnesis? Yeah, the remembrance of the past. Anamnesis, according to Plato, is the recollection of ideas in which the soul had known in a previous existence, especially by means of reasoning. But when reasoning has faltered, when the soul of a people or a nation has willfully or woefully forgotten, then there must be an anamnesis, a proactive process of countering the antithesis of anamnesis, amnesia. So we must go back. We must look back, acknowledging that racism is a defining factor in our shared history. We must look back, recognizing that the struggle for equity of gender, orientation, age, and status requires an intersectional pursuit of justice. We look back to journey forward towards a more inclusive and equitable future we all can share. A future with renewed social structures that sustain equality and provide the last, the least, and the left out broadened access to decision making. That's why we stir the waters, to drive us ever forward to becoming a more perfect union.
Stirring the water, stirring, ooh, stirring, ooh. We must keep stirring, gotta keep stirring. We must keep stirring.
And we'll keep on stirring till justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
See the man who is homeless, though destitute he is no less, hoping for help, a chance to get on his feet.
That's what he needs. A single mother is striving to raise her kids while surviving. Unequal pay and injustice, how could this be? So we say,
Injustice everywhere, threatens justice everywhere. Injustice anywhere, summons action everywhere. Hand in hand, we understand. We are one family, bound by love. So we fight for human rights till everybody sees the light. Freedom really is offered. We must demand. Oppressed, we demand. We demand. The time for freedom is always at hand. It's at hand. Take a stand. Injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. Injustice anywhere summons action everywhere. Hand in hand, we understand. We are one family, bound by love. We fight for human rights.
for the young and the
We
old,
fight for human rights.
for the meek and the bold,
We fight for human rights.
For the gay and the straight,
We fight for human rights.
immigrant or enslaved.
We fight for human rights.
for the black, white, or brown,
We fight for human rights.
for the poor and those cast down.
We fight for
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to Nolan Williams Jr. and the New Works Voices of America for their inspiring, inspirational opening performance. And we feel it's a fitting way to kick off this Smithsonian series of national conversations about race for the institutional-wide initiative, Reckoning with Our Racial Past. Now, it is my deep pleasure to introduce the moderator for tonight's panel, NBC News correspondent Morgan Radford.
And thank you, Dr. Mack, for the wonderful introduction, for having us here tonight. It's my pleasure to be with you. I'm Morgan Radford. I'm an anchor and correspondent for NBC News. That means you might see I'm on Today's Show or Nightly News with Lester Holt, or my own show, which I co-anchor at noon and 1 p.m. nationally. So thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. Tonight, we're having a conversation about race. It's something that a lot of us in this room have worked with professionally or personally, and we understand it from an intrinsic place. But it's also a topic that, in the past 2 years, we've seen the general consciousness awaken to. We've seen this national conversation follow the death of George Floyd, follow the discrepancies we saw in our healthcare system after the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it's a conversation we want to dive into today with an incredible and diverse group of panelists. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome them to the stage. We have Stacy Boland, a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indian, and also the CEO of the National Indian Health Board, a nonprofit organization that represents tribal governments. Stacy, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. We also have Theodore Gonzalez. He is the curator of Asian Pacific American History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. He is an author, a professor, a Fulbright scholar, and has held fellowships at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the Library of Congress. Theo, feel free to come on up and join us and take your seat whenever you're ready. And then we also have Amanda Nguyen, founder and CEO of RISE, the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize nominee, 2022 Time Woman of the Year, and currently, get this, an astronaut scientist candidate at the Astronautical Science Institute. So let's give a big round of applause for Amanda, who will join us here on the stage in just a moment as well. And Dometi Pongo, he is the host of the MTV docuseries True Life Crime and multiple MTV News franchises, including Need to Know. He focuses primarily on the intersection of culture and social justice, like the Smithsonian's channeled program, Conversations in Context. His firm, Pongo Strategy Group, really helps organizations sort of tell their own compelling stories. So in just a moment, oh, here he is. Dometi is joining us here on the stage. And finally, on our panel here, we also have Akima Price, a community leader here in the Washington, D.C. area. And she focuses on social justice and equitable environmentalism. And what's really cool is she does a meaningful park engagement program, and it uses nature as this medium to connect economically distressed African-American communities to nature so that they can ultimately feel better about themselves, their communities, and their parks. So please welcome Akima. And although she won't be a panelist with us, if you see just behind this black curtain, Ashanti, if you can, just stand up and give us a wave. Ashanti Gardner is there. She is an illustrator, incredibly talented, and creating a graphic recording of our discussion. So it'll sort of help us visualize this conversation, and then we'll come back to it at the end and see what Ashanti has come up with. Thank you so much, Ashanti. We appreciate it. So before we begin our conversation, I would, if we can, just do a moment of silence for the people whose lives were lost to incidents of injustice, but also to the people we lost globally and right here at home due to the pandemic. So if we can, just close our eyes for a moment of silence. Thank you for that. Before we begin our conversation, let's talk about questions. We want this to be a family-style discussion. So we have questions here that are designed for our panelists, but we also want to hear from you. So you'll see little note cards. You can fill in on the spaces and write your questions towards the end of the program. We'll pass them down to the ends of the aisle. Someone will come and collect them from you. And for those who are joining us online, just feel free to use the questions feature there online. And we will also make sure that we have a recording of those questions and try to get to as many as we can. We'll talk for about 40 minutes here on the stage and leave about 15 minutes for questions from you guys. So does that sound good? Great. And just to be clear, as we begin, the few ground rules that kind of we want to just use to guide our conversation. Just one, remember that everyone's involved here, right? In every seat, there's a leader. There's someone who can contribute in their communities once they leave this conversation. This is meant to be a conversation that can ultimately and hopefully inspire some action, right? Wherever you go in your communities. But a second thing that's just really important to me, race can be a sensitive topic. And I just hope that every question that is submitted and every question that is received is done so in the spirit of wholesome curiosity. This should be a place where we should not be afraid to learn. We should create a safe space where we can have these conversations, and we may not always nail it and get it perfectly right, and it can be messy, and you can have some mistakes, but let's do so in the spirit of really learning and connecting and communicating with one another. And finally, I think that it's about taking care of ourselves, right? It's about treating ourselves well and treating other people well, not just tonight, but when we leave here. So if we can do that as we begin our conversation, I think we'll have a robust and wonderful, as I mentioned, family-style conversation. So let's go ahead and start with our questions here. Thank you again so much for joining us. If you can, I would like to start with you, Akima and Dometi, because we saw in the past couple years, there was this sort of collective national reckoning when it came to race, but there was also this very individual reckoning that a lot of people experienced, not only personally, but professionally. Can you tell us what you saw in the past 2 years, how it affected your work and your approach to your work in these communities?
I know for me, just as an African-American woman I'm in the environmental field, if you will, and there's, because it's conservation-based, it's always pretty much been a upper class, middle class, white-led kind of thing, because you're coming from people who own land and so forth. And I know for me, it was really frustrating at times because I was already the go-to, like, what do black people think about this? And, so on top of that, especially around George Floyd, but what it did for me, though, was it cracked open people's understanding of what I had been trying to talk about all this time, because there were a lot of people that didn't want to believe that racism was real. They labeled me an angry black woman. And so now they think they started to feel anger for themselves and kind of understand where I was coming from, because it was never about being divisive and us versus them, but it's respecting the trauma that we've already been holding, let alone what it did for us as humans to see that happen to another human, but then also what that meant for that layer of just confirmation that things aren't right, that we've been unhealthy for a very long time. But also the other side of that for me was I worked like doing nature-based trauma work. So I was also in a prime place because parks started to get overused during COVID, and people started looking naturally, returning back to nature for that healing without even being aware of it. So it was actually prime time for me when that started to happen. It was uncomfortable and hurtful, but I did feel like there was some sort of full circle thing happening that at least made it better for me as I pushed through as just an American who had to suffer that, let alone an African-American woman and all those other things. So I think it was an unhealthy cracking of a shell of understanding that needed to happen. I think somewhere in there were some lessons that were valuable that needed to happen, unfortunately.
And there were lessons that were tough for a lot of people to come by.
Yes.
You know what I mean? There were some growing pains. So, Mati, when you're having these conversations on a national scale, when you're doing them for MTV, what is the feedback you're getting? Like, how did the approach to your work and the reception of your work change during this time?
It's so interesting because it was somewhat bittersweet how there was these alarm bells that we were ringing this whole time that kind of fell on deaf ears, even in progressive groups. Like, it's not like I have a newsroom that isn't trying to propel ideas that foster humanity and seeing the fullness of other folks, but they wouldn't always see the connection I'm trying to make between this pop culture story and this larger narrative that speaks to what I experienced as a black man in America. And when George Floyd happened, it was one of the first times in my lifetime that everybody was collectively going toward the same wavelength. Like, for example, before I ended up at MTV, I was at a news station in Chicago, and I remember we were covering the Laquan McDonald shooting, the 17-year-old who was shot 16 times on the west side of Chicago. And I was in my reporting, I kind of was going back and forth with other reporters because they thought I might sound biased by already calling this what it was. And some of those same reporters who are still dear friends, I know they mean well, after the George Floyd, I don't know if a lot of black folks had this while your white friends were sending you like I'm sorry letters and stuff. Like, hey, what can I do to help? You know what I mean? And so I started getting these notes from these reporters I'd worked with that said, yo, we get it now. And it was a refreshing moment, but it was bittersweet because I had been saying these things and I was somewhat gaslit to think that my reporting or my objectivity as a reporter was in question because of how I wanted to frame these events. And now, fast forward, and I was able to, in the first story about George Floyd, call it a lynching, which is exactly what it was. And I defined a lynching as what it was, without trial, the killing of somebody, usually in public, often by hanging, but not necessarily so. That's exactly what this was. And I don't think I would have been able to use that nomenclature if not for this collective moment we had.
Really important. Certainly as a journalist, I can appreciate, what you're saying. Amanda, there was a lot of focus, right, on the African-American community and the Black experience after the death of George Floyd. But then when the virus happened, we saw this vitriol towards Asian Americans. And what was fascinating to me, as someone who's been covering, I remember sending a pitch before this stuff started tweaking, and I said, guys, this is about to go left. I can see this, let's cover it. And kind of people weren't sure, they didn't know, and then look what happened. We saw these incidents happen, and I guess I'm curious to you, you went to Instagram and you used social media, which is where we saw a lot of the strength in the Asian American, the AAPI community come together. But the truth is, these things were happening before, and no one was talking about them before. Why do you think this was different? Why do you think this was the time that people woke up and realized what was happening to our Asian American brothers and sisters?
Well, first of all, I have to say that Stop Asian Hate would not exist without Black Lives Matter. So it happened, yes, that's true. So it happened because we had an incredible moment that was trailblazed for us and that people stood in solidarity with us. The other thing that I do want to talk about is what you briefly touched on, which is that it wasn't only the journalists that were pushing for it, it was higher ups that needed to greenlight these things. And so when we talk about the network of distribution of information, right, we live in an attention economy. Who gets to decide what stories are reported on, and who gets to decide which stories human lives are valuable enough. And that's why I turned to social media, because there are less gatekeepers there. And people responded to it. For the first time in a long time, we heard this vulnerable, these stories come out from the AAPI community and critically from other community members. My video would not have gone viral if Amir Thompson, if Questlove did not repost it. And he was the first one who, I wouldn't be here without him, especially in this work. So I'm really grateful to him. I'm grateful to Alicia Garza and to so many people who've been doing this work.
Really important, yeah. Theo, I want to bring you in here because, the Smithsonian, you all collect artifacts, you collect items to document this moment in history, and this was a moment unlike any of us had ever experienced. How did you sort of capture physically what this moment is? How will we remember it? Was there an artifact or an item that sort of stuck out to you and said, this is what tells this story?
Well, there are several objects that came to mind, and certainly one that I ended up collecting with a colleague over at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum was a racket that was used by Naomi Osaka. And we have to go back to 2020 during the US Open. She wins that US Open, but then she takes to the 7 final matches, and she wears 7 BLM masks, each with a different name, including George Floyd. And she is so moved by what is happening around her, this person of Japanese and Haitian descent, and she cannot remain silent. And so she puts it out there in an interesting way, but and this is what I love about working at the Smithsonian. We get a chance to collect objects that tell different kinds of stories. And certainly there's the object of those 7 masks, those 7 objects, and then her racket. that tells a particular moment in time, a particular story. But it also can be anchored to the other objects that we have in our collections. And I work at the National Museum of American History, and we have Muhammad Ali's robe and gloves and trunks. So again, it's not just about him as a heavyweight champion. It's also the fact that this was a celebrity athlete who spoke out against the Vietnam War, and he paid a price for it. And so we can trace these questions, these objects across history, across the decades, and link how celebrities have used their platform to think about social justice. And in many ways, it's not an isolated story. Naomi Osaka's story becomes one of a long arc. And it's not just about 2020, it's not just about 2022. It's about decades of a tradition of speaking out. And so that's what I think objects can do for us. And when we have visitors come, we want them to be able to make these connections. And sometimes, it's not going to be immediately available. They'll be inspired by thinking about Muhammad Ali. They'll be inspired about that particular win in 2020. But hopefully they'll be able to make those connections either inside the building or out on the street or later when they're having a meal. And that's the best part of the job for us, is to be able to facilitate those kinds of connections.
I love that you said decades of tradition, because what you're describing is a legacy of courage, right?
Yeah.
You also said a word that was really important, and it was isolation. I can't help but notice when I'm listening to Amanda talk about Latinos and Black people who have helped, bolster the cause. And what we're talking about is sort of integration that we've seen, right? People coming together to say, hey, these experiences we're experiencing, we're not alone. And oh, by the way, we've seen this before. Stacey, what's something that's interesting, you've worked with a lot of missing and murdered Indigenous women and groups. I remember when I was reporting on what was happening during the pandemic in Indian country, it was fascinating because while we're talking about these other groups coming together, there still seems to be a separateness to the way that these stories are treated when they come from Indian country. And, the inequality we saw in access in healthcare was staggering. The number of missing women, just missing women. When you look at the numbers happening, for example, in Montana compared to the national average, it is startling. When you think of that isolation, what is it that you think people don't understand about the issues that are facing your community? And what is the most pressing need that people need to understand in order to help?
Miigwech, I need to do a traditional greeting. Ani Indigenous Mikinek. Hello, my native name is Mikinek, which means turtle woman. So thank you, Miigwech, for allowing me to say that. I think that the number one disease American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian people suffer from is anonymity. In America, if you're not seen, there's no problem, right? So you look at a history that put us on what can originally be accurately portrayed as refugee camps in our own lands. You're standing on Indian country. We're sitting in Indian country right now. The Piscataway Indians, this was where they lived. This was their homeland. So I think that it's very difficult for American Indians to access the media and to have our stories told in the mainstream. I'm not exactly sure why, if it's just tradition that we're not discussed in K through 12 education, we're not discussed in any kind of a regular nomenclature in American culture, yet we are America itself. So the thing about COVID-19 that really brought things to the forefront was we just decided at the National Indian Health Board, the day the pandemic was announced, that we were transforming our entire organization into a COVID-19 response center and a resource center for tribal nations. And we made a very aggressive effort to get our story into the media, because the number one issue we are suffering from is a total lack of funding for our health care. Earlier this week, on August 31st, the CDC put out a report that said American Indian life expectancy dropped 6.6 years in 2021.
In just a year.
From COVID.
Wow.
So that's a crisis. And 2 days ago, they announced that they were distributing $3.9 billion to address public health emergencies, which tribes were not eligible to apply for. So do we have any kind of cognizance about what a crisis really is? Indians are still not able to access the Public Health Emergency Fund. So the number one thing that we need in Indian country is advance appropriations for the Indian Health Service, so when the Congress doesn't do their work, our healthcare doesn't automatically stop the day the money runs out, and permanent funding for the Indian Health Service and for our healthcare for our people. Access to emergency public health monies, very rational things that anyone in America would count on and need, but our communities don't have those things.
You mentioned something interesting when you described anonymity. Can we just rewind for a second? I mean, Theo, I'm curious because you've been, going to these colleges and universities and you talk about these things. Akima, you're in the community with environmental work talking about these things. Have you noticed a difference in the way that race is even talked about now?
Yes. I mean, again, I think it comes down to the more people are feeling from an empathetic or humanitarian lens, because, just as an American, unless you just have no heart, because some people can watch these things happen and just change the channel and go, it's not me. But I think a lot of people, again, specifically in the environmental arena, climate change, right? This is another thing that impacts folks. I mean, my industry is thinking about food, food, water, shelter, safety, and water is a big issue that's definitely on the forefront of a next sort of kind of problem that we're going to be thinking about differently. I think people's minds were open and, again, realized that these type of issues don't necessarily discriminate. Like, you're impacted as a human, you're impacted as an American, and you can keep living in this bubble and thinking that it doesn't impact you. But again, when these major things happen like COVID that, again, does not discriminate, we all had to sit at home. That's right. COVID didn't pick like, I'm going to pick you because you're black. It was like, you're human, right? So I think it gave people a sense of empathy that I'm sort of trying to capitalize on. I hate that word, but capitalize on in the sense of like, okay, now let's have more one-on-one experiences and conversations where I get to actually experience an African-American person that I maybe have never experienced before. Right. And we're able to laugh together, we're scared together, we're concerned about our future together. But we're also, again, in those moments, building a new sense of community that's more inclusive by nature, because that's where it was before we got this divisive term of race where we thought we were better than, less than. I mean, some of these things, again, they're unfortunate things, but I'm like, bring us together, universe. Keep having these catastrophic things happen to bring us closer together, because we have no choice in those moments. Like, there's not enough money to cure you from cancer. There's not, there's nobody that's safe from some of these things that we're impacted by. So I'm looking at the glass half full side of like, what does this do for us? So 5 years from now, maybe there's an inch more in humanity that we, less racist folks or more people that can kind of look at me as a human as opposed to an African-American woman.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I've been teaching now for about 30 years, and I've seen students bring all kinds of questions and insecurities and their dreams to the classrooms. And one thing that's amazing is, especially since George Floyd, I hope that there's a change in terms of how people think about race, that they're willing to do away with the euphemisms about these experiences, that we cannot refer to the euphemisms of these experiences. We have to, in many ways, use a very specific vocabulary as to who did what to whom, and to lay out the facts as they are or as they should be in the historical record. Now, that's a daunting task, but that's the job of a history professor. That's the job of a history museum, and I happen to work at one, so I'm not going to shy away from that. But when the students insist on certain pronouns, when students insist on a level of care concerning their well-being, their mental well-being, mental health care, they're talking to us about a culture shift that to them, it's like asking the fish about the water. You never ask the fish about the water, right? There is a culture shift, and they're telling us about the future, which is the present. So I think about the work that we do at the National Museum of American History when we collect objects like this banner from San Francisco's Chinatown about a Chinatown community that was trying to anticipate what was going to happen with this COVID-19 pandemic. They didn't wait for euphemisms or for a media. They didn't wait for the press to come to them. They decided to put it out there. 1,000 people in San Francisco, 11 days before we knew that this was a global pandemic. They did not wait. And so what was fascinating about those folks in San Francisco, February 29, 2020, they were armed with history. And I hope that everyone that walks into every part of the Smithsonian is engaged with their histories, such that it's not a euphemism. Yes, we want to be able to discover, but those connections, that Chinatown community reminded me that they have lived with a century and a half. Since 1882, they've been living with these questions of what it means to resist, not just to be a victim of racist violence, but they are also accessing their own deep traditions of resistance. Those things, I think, when young people are telling us we can't wait, I think many of us have to be responsive in every exhibit, every gallery, every web label that we write.
You talk about being responsive. It's interesting because I think I couldn't help but notice as we had this sort of cultural shock, there was a lot of performance. There was a lot of performance around how suddenly we're gonna, open our doors, we're gonna have these uncomfortable conversations. And I saw corporations do it, I saw institutions do it. It was like a hot topic for a minute. People wanted to show that they were open, show that they were changing, show that they were accepting. And while I think a lot of people appreciated the demonstration, there was some fall off, right? I mean, how many of the changes do you think you saw in the past 2 years stuck? Are they sticking? I open that up to anyone.
I'll go with one anecdotal thing that kind of changed and stuck a little bit. Some of those conversations, we had them internally at Paramount, and Chris McCarthy, the president, MTV Entertainment Group there, we did these forums where everybody in the company, as we were collectively going through this moment, were having real conversations about microaggressions, things that we're dealing with in the office. All of these conversations, we invited folks from different organizations to talk and not moderate them. And in those conversations, I used it as my opportunity to talk about what I experienced in the field that I've kind of said, but I didn't feel like it was addressed directly, such as a diverse crew behind the scenes. When I'm doing a show like True Life Crime and you're talking to a black family about somebody who was murdered in their family and everybody behind the camera is white, it feels voyeuristic. And so even though they're comfortable with me, I've never seen these people in my home, let alone interested in what I have to say until it's for entertainment. And I talked about these in these meetings. And season 2, I got a black DP, I got an Asian showrunner, I got a black PA, and then just those different things that I felt comfortable after downloading with a family, talking to my guy and not feeling like I had to code switch or it was just these small things that happened within the workforce behind the camera that I didn't think happens on purpose. People hire within their network, but there was an intentionality that remained. So just in my little sphere, those things still exist. But more broadly in the industry, we've also seen DEI VPs hired and departments let go 2 years later. We've seen writ large in the industry, a lot of programs that were robust in 2020 kind of fall off. Budget slashed once it wasn't a hot issue. So in my little space, yes, but I know writ large, I don't know if it's the same.
Anyone else?
I think it's really exciting that we have Res Dogs. I mean, that is
It's a good
fabulous
show, right?
Yeah,
You guys
it's
see the
great.
show?
It's a great
Res
show.
Dogs, man.
Oh, I love that.
Tune in.
Yeah, I think it's on Netflix or something. It's on Netflix
Yeah,
or Hulu?
it's on Hulu.
Hulu, yeah, definitely something to check out. We talk about these communities coming forward and trying to kind of make these things last. Can we talk just for a second about the role of allyship? That's something I think about a lot, right? I mean, when Doma T was talking about people sending these text messages like, hey, you're my black friend, are you doing okay after George Floyd died, right? Like that's, what is the role of allyship? Because, my response to those kinds of texts is like, pull up, pull up. Someone said to me during that time, well, I can't comment on it because I'm not a person of color. And I'm like, no, that actually makes you the perfect person to comment on it, right? Because we should all have skin in the game. I don't have to be a member, I don't have to identify as LGBTQ to understand that this is an important issue to me, right? This is something I want to make sure we're expanding the boundaries of inclusion in our country, in our spaces. So what does the role of allyship look like between these different communities? Amanda?
Yeah, it relates to the performance question, quite frankly. And And I'll mention that it has been a really interesting experience for me to see how people within my own community, and I really do love my Asian American Pacific Islander brothers, but to see the members, yes, rise up for our community, but then really lack in allyship, especially when it comes to the intersection of race and gender. And when we're talking about the 78% of AAPI women who experience this discrimination, who is the one who is doing that? Is it our AAPI brothers, uncles? And on top of that, the model minority myth is a very destructive myth. It talks about, for folks who may not be familiar, dividing and conquering, pitting communities against each other so that we think of it as zero sum, when in fact it's white supremacy we should be fighting. So, I'm very grateful. I'm grateful. I think it's good. I think allyship is amazing, and that there are many ways to do it, and that being anti-racist is an active verb. That it is a growing process. You continually do it, and again, I'm grateful to those who have started their journey, continuing their journey, and going further in their journey.
Stacey, what do you think?
About allyship?
Yeah, I mean, about allyship, how do you sort of, especially when we talked about sort of the separateness sometimes people can treat, for example, Indian country, how do you encourage people to understand that these issues are your issues? These issues are our issues. When they're our issues, we all have to roll up our sleeves and chip in.
I think that when you have a conversation like this, the things that we say in Indian country, every single person here can say, this isn't an Indian problem, this is an American problem. This is a problem and an opportunity that belongs to all of us. And I think what we saw when the Black Lives Matter movement exploded is that we don't want to live in a country like this. And those of us who see a better America, who see a more inclusive but also joyful together America, will join together to bring that forth, because no one of us is going to be able to do that alone. And that was the power of seeing people just flood the streets everywhere in this country. American Indians, white people, black people, Hispanics, Asian, everybody out in the street, basically saying, enough. That, to me, those are the people who are going to forge new America. And we're in that together, because it will not happen with any one sector.
Yes, Akima.
Well, the one more piece I want to say, because it goes back to the performative. Because again, those things happen on TV, you get riled up, but then you go to work and you still hold your purse when you get next to somebody different than you, right? My measure of allyship, and it's not just about money, but it's, people show you what they care about how they show how they spend their time and their money. And I can say from a good perspective, and at least in the environmental field, one, environment is not just trees and grass. So when we talk environment now, I think a lot of folks are expanding their mind to include the social side, not just the physical side of trees and grass, but the crack, like these other things that became environmental issues. But I see more money being opened up to where it's not as restrictive around the number of trees you plant, but the number of people you engage, or the amount of innovation you use, or encouraging more partnership between, say, a conservation-based organization and, say, a justice-based organization, or an organization working with reentry parents. Like, I'm seeing innovation in my field that naturally the allies are the ones that are kind of rising up, being the ones that are writing the check and making the way for the innovation. Because those gatekeepers, when they keep those kind of, you got to do this, you got to have a master's to do that, and you got to da-da-da-da, you eliminate a lot of people. And then when they wonder why these people aren't in these circles. Whereas when you start talking about trees from a perspective of safety, like planting trees in honor of people who have died as a result of gun violence, that allows me to then welcome in communities who before was like, I ain't planting no trees, but if I can name that tree in honor of somebody that mattered to me, I'm there. And then when these two people are here, and you may be different from me, but we both have lost somebody, right? So I'm kind of going all over the place, but the idea is with the typical people who used to be in the environmental field, it's opening and diversifying now, where environment doesn't just mean trees and grass, and allowing for these bigger conversations and places for this money and these people to really show up where it matters. Like, I don't need more trees. I need less guns on my street. I need these other places. And so that interdisciplinary kind of intersectionality that's necessary for this stuff to happen, for that innovation that allows for those real shifts. I love smoking out performers, Because I like to do the work where like either you come or you don't. And if I've had 10 events and you haven't come and you're still calling black people hard to reach, who's the problem, right?
I love what you said, because even the specific examples you're giving, right? You want to like go protest in the street, but you want to hold your purse closer when a black person passes.
Right.
I don't think people get that, right? Like we sit in these rooms and we have these conversations and they feel very ethereal. They feel very theoretical. When you talk about boots on the ground, what does that look like? How, people of color are tired. They're saying, why does the work of diversity fall on me? Why do I have to do the work to create more space, right? So what is it that you would each want an ally to do? How do we take this conversation out of the echo chamber of people who care and turn it into action? If you were talking to someone who didn't come here tonight, what is the one thing you would want an ally to do?
I'm gonna go first just because I feel like mine is the most like simple. And it underscores what you said a moment ago, Morgan. How we key in on our interpersonal relationships. When you're in a meeting and that black woman says an idea and no one pays attention, and then the white guy says the exact same thing she said, and everybody says, that's a great idea, John. If you are that male in that room or any person of privilege and you call that out, that's a form of allyship in the workplace. Making people comfortable around you when they're sharing their truth and not silencing them or arguing away how they feel. That happens a lot. And then I would say just allyship among BIPOC people. I just learned about the MMIW crisis about 2 years ago because we did a story for True Life Crime on Hannah Harris, who was an indigenous woman who was murdered. And it was a wake-up call for me because I was so focused on issues for my community. And I knew we talked about systemically what has happened to indigenous people, but I didn't think about what presently, the disparities in health, disparities in what stories get, what police investigate in tribal communities.
Right.
So many different things. There were so many balls dropped when I was researching how the jurisdictions had to handle this case. And I was convicted because I'm like, man, here I am, Mr. Social Justice Story, and I completely missed my neighbor. And so even among BIPOC folk, thinking about what it means when we perpetuate model minority tropes or all of those different things, how can we coalesce with one another and support causes of each other?
Right on.
Amanda?
I think it's education. You mentioned this earlier, but there are so many stories of our solidarity, and we don't know them because it's not in our education system. Solidarity between our communities, wins that can teach us, how we can organize, community organize. So I think it's about educating. I also think power doesn't give up power willingly, and that it's a struggle. If you do have that privilege, there's a quote by this author, and it really made me think. She said, I have never met somebody who had privilege who didn't exercise the fullest extent of that privilege sometime in their life. And when we're talking about not equality but equity, for those who do have that higher step in life, it will feel uncomfortable. It will feel uncomfortable because you're confronting centuries of systems that have told you that you have this privilege in some way. But to do that work is not only, I think hopefully helpful for your own personal journey, but truly about imagining the world that we want. Because what is America but an experiment? And if we are to live up to the promise of the creed of this country, then I do believe that we should absolutely be thinking of our community members.
Theo?
Well, to answer your question, I would say that everyone needs to develop a longer attention span. We need to think in paragraphs and in complete sentences that
Or
are
140 characters on the internet, right?
that are intentional. We need to speak with intention and care, and we need to understand our histories. How did we get here? How did our families get to this place? All of our families. And so that's a lot of reckoning. But I think people need to dig in for the long haul and stop avoiding, again, some of the euphemisms about why uncle and auntie did this and how did they came here. It's like we need to get to the truth of where and when we come into this place. And the other part of it is understanding that I'm very much a traditionalist. I love the tradition of resistance. That is part of an American tradition, and every culture has a tradition of resistance. They've got the troublemakers, the experimenters, the weirdos, the wackos. They're the ones that are on the side. They're outside of the mainstream. But that is also a tradition, and it is decades old. It is centuries old. And we can connect that again and again and again. When we go back, we'll find much more connections than divisions. So that, to me, is a great promise that I think is awaiting us when we deal with the reckoning.
What about you, Stacey?
Can I share something historical?
Please.
May I? Okay, so when Columbus bumbled onto this land in 1492, he bumbled around looking for some spices and left a legacy. What people don't often know is that so that was 1492, saw the riches, did what he did to the people. But at that same time, explorers from Portugal and Spain were in Africa, discovering, pretty sure the Africans knew they were there. We knew we were here. But in 1493, not to waste any time, they went to the Vatican and said to the Pope, we have all this rich land over here that we found in India, which was here, and we have all these savages on this land that are interfering with our ability to enjoy this land. What can you do about that? And the Pope said, are they Catholics? Are they Christians? And the answer was no. And so there was a papal bull declaring, we don't have souls. So things that don't have a soul, like a deer, which my people, of course, believe have a soul, they can't own land. They can't own resources. And you can kill them if they get in your way, right? So that was in the doctrine of discovery. The same doctrine of discovery said, oh, those people in Africa, sure. Just round them up, put them to work somewhere else in this world because they don't have souls either. We're forever in the same soil because of the doctrine of discovery. That is the root of colonization, and these discussions are the children of colonization. They have grown up, and we need to decolonize our minds, and that's what we're in the process of doing, and I think that's extremely exciting. So for us, having survived a genocide attempt, perpetual efforts, we're only about 4% to 6% of the US population. There are 574 tribes in this country, federally recognized tribes. They only reside in 34 states, with the states formed around them. So to have political influence, it's really difficult to do when you're only in 34 states. So if people care about our people, we need you. We need your voices. We need you to hold be shoulder to shoulder with us. And we will be there with you. But we need solidarity. That's what we need. Thank you.
Shoulder to shoulder. Speaking of shoulder to shoulder, if we can go ahead and open up now for questions from the audience. If you haven't already, please feel free to pass your cards down to the end of the aisle.
Can I add my one word?
Yeah, while they do that, while you guys pass your cards down to the aisle and someone will bring those questions to me up here so that we can talk about them. Akeem, we'll turn to you.
I'm going to say a hokey word. Maybe some people said hokey, but my word is love. Like, that would be the one thing I would say that people need to do is love. Because, so I grew bitter in my early phase of, because I've been in the field for about 30 years, but early on, I got a lot of racism, and I was bitter toward these women who were like ugly to me, ugly. I remember being in Denver, in this room with these other environmental educators. I'm like, I can't stand this woman, blah, blah. I look up and see this quote by Dietrich Baumhofer. It says, those who love their dream of community will destroy the community, while those who love those around them will build community. And it was in that moment that it hit me that I can't do this work not liking you. And I had to find the oneness. I couldn't stand this woman. She was so ugly to me, but I was like, we both have noses. We both have hands. Like, I had to find the oneness. I did. It saved me, y'all. I promise you. Because that bitterness is like a cancer. It'll choke you out. And it was impacting how I was doing my work. And I was so grateful for that quote. And I still use it now because a lot of people look at love, and that's a deep word. And it could mean a lot of different things for a lot of people, but it's the truest sense of what we were put here to do, I believe. And that's our life's journey, is to pull away and work through these layers of trauma and so forth to get to that place. Because when you vibrate at that level, you can't help but to be an ally across the board to other humans in general. Because that, I think, is at the root of us. So just wanna
Can you
put my
share
little
that
thing.
quote one more time?
The quote is, if those who love their dream of community will destroy community, while those who love those around them will build community. Because I'm sitting there like, I got the best idea in the room because I'm black and I know da-da-da, but I couldn't stand these people in the room. So I was still stagnant. I had good ideas, but it wasn't going to go anywhere until I was able to find that oneness. And it didn't mean being fake, going, hey, girl. It just meant I wasn't holding hate for you because of what you did for me. I forgave you. I saw the humanity in you and why you were such an, to me. Right. And that was hard work, but it was liberating when I felt that. So
that's beautiful. We have a question from the audience. How can we integrate conversations of economics and race? Do we start with reparations? What about broadening resources for Native American reservations?
Oh, I guess that's me.
Well, I think economics and races broadly, but yes, Native Americans, I think that's you.
Well, in World War II, after the United States had been very engaged in the war in Europe, we had a Marshall Plan after the war to rebuild Europe. We put billions and billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe. Nobody invested in our communities after the wars that were perpetuated on us. So our organization has adopted the idea of a Marshall Plan to rebuild Indian country. We did it 2 days ago. I'm very excited.
That's great. That's great.
Theo, do you have any thoughts more broadly on economics and race?
Well, you know, we often talk about these concepts, these abstract concepts of race and gender and sexuality as if they are separate from each other. And yet, all of these concepts are deeply imbricated with questions of class. There is not a racial question that is not also a class question. There is not a gender question that is not also a class question. When we think about reproductive health and rights, that is also very much deeply a class question. When we're thinking about race and the privilege that it affords certain people and the denial of humanity to others, then that is deeply a refiguring and reallotment of resources. So we can't separate the two or any of these. We have to think about these intersectionally. And I think my teachers and others and other mentors, especially in public history and in ethnic studies, that understood these terms as deeply intersectional for many decades. It ended up being expressed in race, class, gender studies, and then the creation of separate departments and different kinds of analytics built around it. But there's not an economic question that doesn't undergird everything that we've been talking about. So I think part of it, again, is to develop a longer attention span also means understanding that these questions about race and gender and sexuality and others are also deeply about class and economic issues. So we can't get around that. I think they're too important to leave into neat and discrete boxes.
I think another one of those boxes is what we were talking about earlier, Kima, with the environment. And one of the questions from the virtual audience is the conservation of clean water has been appearing in the news cycle more and more. How do we discuss clean water access beyond just Flint and Jackson?
I think for a lot of the people I serve, they're so caught up in day-to-day traumas. I mean, people take water for granted. They just assume when I turn my spigot on, and a lot of people aren't even drinking water. But honestly, they get sodas and they don't think about the waters in the food you eat and just the importance of water. But I think getting people out of that phase of panic around day-to-day issues of safety allow me to have the comfort and the privilege to not be scared in this moment, to think beyond tomorrow, because a lot of people who live in trauma can't think beyond today, let alone tomorrow, let alone 5 years, let alone a larger water crisis. I think it helps, unfortunately, when they hear about Flint and when they hear about these other water crises and go, dang, that's really real. Like when I was doing this work early on, like even 2012, I was going out to these different cities and talk about environmental issues, and nowhere before other than when I was in, where was I at? I was over near Mexico. It was near Phoenix or somewhere, New Mexico. They were talking about water access issues. I had no idea that anybody in America had like issues around access to water. So just people getting the context that it is a bigger issue helps me when I'm trying to be safe. Like I can't even think about water. But when I hear something like that, it puts it on my radar and at least begins to open the conversation. Because some of these like Clean Water Act and some of these bigger conversations around water conservation are just like so far removed from the day-to-day needs and safety issues of the communities I serve. It's definitely in my back pocket for like later down the road or when the opportunity comes around water. We're still getting people to just understand the importance of drinking water.
If I could add to that real quick too, sometimes pop culture gives us a way into these conversations to make them quote unquote sexy, for lack of a better word, like when the California droughts, when there was a story about Kim Kardashian and her family using too much water, or you know, they have the rules around how often you can water your lawns and when to turn them off. And I chuckled at the story when I first saw it too. I don't want to report on the Kardashians. Wait a minute. This is an opportunity to use this story, hey, Kim Kardashian, to talk about this other issue regarding water. And then before you know it, you're 5 minutes in, you realize we only said her name in the headline. So sometimes these pop culture stories allow us a way into conversations that don't seem as interesting to folks who aren't really keen on the environmental aspect of it.
Theo, I think this one is for you. We spoke lots about COVID revealing and nurturing attitudes on race. Are there other recent historical events that reveal such insights, especially recently?
Concerning the Asian American community, yes.
All right, even broadly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, COVID has affected the Asian American community in a very deep way, and what it's also done is it's revealed some long-standing institutional practices. So again, it's not just the present, it's also an opportunity to think about the past. And when I'm thinking about the Filipino American community from which I come, there's been the case of Filipino medical practitioners and health providers who've been disproportionately affected by their exposure to the treatment of COVID patients over the last couple of years. But then when we think about why is that the case, why are there so many Filipino nurses? And that became a headline for many outlets. We have to think, we have to do away with the stereotypes of thinking about Filipinos as natural caregivers. Again, this kind of essentializing of certain people as they must be naturally good at caring for others. The truth is the United States, when it conducted its war against the Philippines in 1899, it developed a nursing school in the Philippines as early as 1907. So the training of nurses by the Americans began at the early part of the 20th century. And they've been built for export ever since, not only in the Philippines, but also in Guam. So when we think about how Filipinos become nurse practitioners throughout the globe, in Ireland, in Australia, in the United States, in the UK, that's a direct result of decades of institutional practice that go back to when the Philippines was a formal colony of the United States. So we are reckoning right now with decisions that took place a century ago. So again, it's longer than a soundbite, but we need time to be able to unpack our own legacies and to, when we attend the funeral of our aunties and uncles who didn't make it as a result of this, we have to realize that there have been decisions made in decades past that are affecting why we're attending this funeral now. So I want to say one more thing about this, because the pandemic affected many of our ability to deal with ritual. We didn't have the ability to celebrate birthdays, to attend funerals. And ritual is deep. It's deep in a lot of our bones, in our blood. And to not have access to the ritual of life and death and birth and celebration, that affects a lot of us. And so being here in this room, it's life-affirming. It is life-affirming. But I hope what we can do is recognize what that pandemic has wrought, because it has disconnected us physically from being able to mark time in the way that is precious to us. And when we're denied that ritual, we're all the worse for it. So we need to reinstate the things that are life-affirming in being connected to us.
Life-affirming connection. We have time, I think, for one more question. So if I can, I'd like to pose this to the group. And maybe Amanda, you can start. It says, Roger Hammerstein in South Pacific wrote, quote, "You have to be carefully taught racism. We are not born racist. How do we stop that teaching by communities and families? How do we undo those teachings?" Amanda?
Well, I think that silence is violence, and that we can all do a little bit more to be more vocal about what we want to learn and to be intentional about that learning. I also really loved your point, to practice that radical empathy and to really be in true community with one another. I think that that's a great starting point.
Demeter, Kima, you want to close this out?
Me?
Yeah, or
Oh, I'd love
Stacey,
to.
jump
Well,
in,
just
yeah.
because we were talking about this upstairs. First of all, we have to be aware that race is a social construct. The more we subscribe to it, the more it lives. And technically, race is voluntary. Like, you can choose your race. You can change your race. We've been taught these things, and there's a lot of legal ramifications associated with race. Like, there's the social aspect of race and there's the legal aspect. And the more we learn about that, the more we can help with this dismantling. And I could talk long about that. But it's really hard to get people to because when I talk about race being voluntary and changing your race, I know some black people like, I'm blackity black, I'm not ever changing my race. But if you trace back the whole origin of why is it black and white, but these other folks have Asian American and, you know, all these other geographical things that connotate their background or their race, whereas blacks and white are colors. Like, what sense does that make? So I think we need to dig deeper on that. And then ultimately, if we look at what this country was really founded on, I mean, technically it's working, right? Wasn't this the plan? Wasn't it supposed to be divisive? Wasn't it supposed to be based on capitalism? Like, I would say, based on what they wanted, like, it is going in that direction. We have to dismantle the root, and that takes a lot of work, right? And it takes our own mental health and awareness and that courage, because it's uncomfortable and it's scary, and there's a lot of people that don't want to have these conversations. But I don't know, my final word would just be like, you know, really investigate what race truly is so we can stop, like maybe 10 years from now, we're not even using it anymore. Maybe.
Before we close out, I do want to make sure we have a little bit of time to just acknowledge the graphics. As we mentioned, Ashanti is finishing up the graphic recording of this conversation. And Ashanti, if we can, we'd love to have you just kind of show everyone, if we can put them up on the screen, what Ashanti's done, and then you can kind of give us a couple of words on your work, Ashanti. That would be lovely. Do you want to take this? Oh, okay. Thank you so much also for doing this, for sharing your art with us. We really appreciate it. And again, if we can pull this up on the screen, this would be lovely. Sure.
I'm in suspense. So why don't
I know,
suspense?
right? Let me see.
Look at you.
Oh.
Is your mic working? Do you have a microphone on?
Wow.
There we go. Thank you.
So this is a graphic recording of tonight's events. So yeah, this is just capturing the seniors as they came in and fight for human rights. And just, you guys talked about decolonizing your minds, so just capture some highlights. Talked about American Indians, you know, having your stories told, the Asian American, just, you know, being ally to you as well, and, you know, being recognized. How is race talked about now? You guys posed a lot of questions that I think we could also individually reflect on. I'm just talking about younger people, students, when they talk with us, how it's about shifting. What they want really is, what they're talking about is shifting the culture, and talking about, you know, saying that they cannot wait. And just, you guys reflected on how many changes stuck in the past year. You guys talked about intersectionality, how to look at all these different and many issues, and just talked about allyship. Overall, how this is an American problem and how we can create a joyful America, and that it is not a zero-sum game, and how we're confronting systems, centuries of systems. So that is the capturing.
Give a round of applause for Ashanti. I love that. I think this was one of my favorite moments. I think that was when Theo was saying, when students tell us about pronouns, it's about cultural shift. I think, Theo, you said, you know, they're telling us about the future, but it's really the present. And Ashanti, I love what you did here. How might we create a joyful America? Isn't that a beautiful dream? A joyful America. Yes. Not even talking about the pain, not even talking about, you know, the trauma, but the inclusion of a joyful America. Thank you, Ashanti. And thank you all.
Thank you.
very much. If we can, just to thank, again, I want to thank Director Deborah Mack and Nolan Williams Jr. and the New Works Voices of America who opened up for us. And a big round of applause to all of our panelists who join us. Just incredibly insightful. Thank you for an honest, insightful conversation. Thank you for coming. For those who joined us online and those who took times out of their day to come and join us live here in this room, we hope that you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. So we appreciate your time, and most importantly, we appreciate your thoughtfulness, your intention, and your effort. So have a good rest of your evening.
You're so good. Good job.
You guys were fantastic. You guys were fantastic.
I was so